Tom Williams, a man from a small town in North Carolina, had always been the type to step up when needed. Growing up in a modest family, with a mechanic father and a schoolteacher mother, he developed values of honesty, loyalty, and resilience. These traits shaped him into a natural leader, someone who protected his peers from bullies and rallied friends for impromptu games. Tom always dreamed of something bigger, and after high school, he decided to join the Marines, inspired by his uncle, who served in Vietnam. His parents were hesitant at first, but eventually supported his decision. Boot camp was tough, but Tom thrived under pressure, earning respect quickly. His first years in the Marines were full of challenges, but they brought clarity to his life. Stationed in Okinawa, Japan, Tom found himself in the middle of a hostage negotiation. His calm demeanor and quick thinking led to a commendation and sparked his new interest in law enforcement. This moment changed his path forever, setting him on the journey to becoming a detective. Tom returned to the States after his tour, determined to pursue a career in criminal justice. He enrolled in a college program while working part-time as a security guard, always pushing himself to succeed. It was during this time that he met Julia, a sharp and ambitious business major. Despite their differing career goals, they found common ground in their love for classic films and long walks in the park. Their connection was instant, and their whirlwind romance led to a simple courthouse wedding just before graduation. After their wedding, Tom and Julia quickly settled into their new lives. Tom, now a fresh graduate, took a position as an emergency dispatcher while awaiting his entry into the police academy. Julia, on the other hand, found a prestigious role at an investment firm, marking the beginning of her ambitious career. Together, they rented a modest apartment in the suburbs, starting their new life with excitement and challenges. However, as Julia's career took off, it brought with it frequent trips to the East Coast. While Tom supported her professional success, these trips began to create subtle strain in their relationship. The long stretches of time apart made Tom feel a growing distance between them, though he never expressed it openly. He trusted Julia completely, believing in the strong foundation they had built together. It was during this time that life changed unexpectedly. Julia announced that she was pregnant, and Tom was thrilled. Their son, Andrew, was born shortly after Tom graduated from the police academy. Julia's pregnancy had been a surprise, but Tom never questioned it. He was overjoyed at the prospect of starting a family. 2 years later, their daughter Marie was born, following a difficult birth. Julia, always a step ahead, convinced Tom to get a vasectomy after Marie's birth, citing health reasons. Tom, trusting his wife and wanting to support her, agreed without hesitation. Despite the joy of their growing family, there were moments of doubt creeping in. Both children looked very much like Julia, blonde hair and blue eyes, traits Tom's mother noticed immediately. She suggested a DNA test to confirm the children's paternity, but Tom brushed it off, trusting Julia fully. Their relationship had always been built on love and mutual trust, and he had no reason to question her. His mother's concerns were dismissed, and Tom continued his life with the assumption that everything was as it seemed. The story took a turn at a company Christmas party hosted by Julia's firm at a Marriott. It was here that Tom met Alf Henriksen, A man from New York with strikingly familiar features, blonde hair and blue eyes, the same as Julia's. Tom's instincts immediately went on alert as Alf introduced himself with a smug smile. "I hear you made detective. Congratulations," Alf said, his voice smooth, but there was something unsettling about him. Tom, ever the professional, remained composed, offering a terse nod in response. The evening passed with Tom keeping a close eye on Julia and Alf, especially when they danced. There was nothing overtly inappropriate about their behavior, but Tom couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. When the night came to an end, Alf made sure to say goodbye to Julia, warmly, and then turned to Tom, adding, "A real pleasure meeting you, sir." The car ride home was tense. Tom had a lot on his mind. "Was that the guy you were engaged to before we met?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Julia hesitated before answering. "Yes, that was him." Tom's emotions swirled with confusion and suspicion. He pressed her further, asking why she had never mentioned her ex-fiancé. Julia explained that Alf worked for a company based in New York and that they hardly saw each other anymore. "He's in a different department," she added. Despite her reassurances, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. The unease he felt at the party didn't dissipate, and as the night went on, his thoughts grew darker. When Julia confessed that they had ended their relationship because Alf didn't want children, Tom tried to push the discomfort away, but something about their history together left him unsettled. He told her it was okay, but in his heart, Tom began to wonder if the past was not as distant as Julia claimed. As time went on, Tom's suspicions began to gnaw at him. Despite Julia's reassurances and their life seemingly settling into a comfortable routine, something felt off. He couldn't pinpoint it at first, but his instincts told him there was more to Julia's work trips and the odd dynamics he sensed among her colleagues. While most of them were cordial, there was an underlying tension that Tom could never quite shake off. One colleague, Alice, stood out to him. Alice had worked with Tom on a case years ago, where she and her husband were key witnesses to a robbery Tom had solved. Since then, they had stayed in touch, but recently, Alice had started acting strangely whenever they bumped into each other. At work events, her glances at Julia and Alf were too intense, too filled with something Tom couldn't place. He tried to brush it off as paranoia, but the nagging feeling persisted. One day, unable to ignore it any longer, Tom decided to pay Julia's office an unannounced visit. He thought he might be overreacting, but something told him he needed to be sure. When he walked into the building, Alice intercepted him. "Julia just stepped out," she informed him quickly. Her tone seemed off, but Tom didn't think much of it at the time. "Do you know when she'll be back?" he asked. Alice, fidgeting slightly, mentioned that Julia was at the legal department and would be back soon. It was in that moment that Alice, seemingly unable to hold her thoughts any longer, asked Tom if he knew about Julia and Alf. "Isn't your marriage open?" Alice asked hesitantly. The words hit Tom like a ton of bricks. "What do you mean?" he asked, his stomach tightening. Alice hesitated but blurted out, "I just thought you knew. You two have an open marriage, right? Because of your injury?" Tom's confusion deepened. He immediately responded, "I've never been injured on duty, and there's nothing open about my marriage." Alice looked uncomfortable. And after a long pause, she confessed, "I have photos. I thought you should know. They've been together for years." Tom's heart raced. Alice sent him the photos, and in the back of his mind, he began to see the unraveling of a long-held illusion. Julia, the woman he trusted implicitly, had been unfaithful for years. He had always believed her, but now everything seemed to be falling apart. Tom's mind was in overdrive as he processed the photos Alice had sent him. He couldn't believe what he was seeing, yet everything in his gut told him it was true. The photos were damning, showing Julia and Alf in intimate moments, their faces filled with the same passion and connection that Tom had once believed was reserved for their marriage. The final image was the hardest to bear. Julia and Alf entering an elevator together, her face tilted toward his, eyes full of longing. Tom's heart sank. He had always prided himself on his keen observational skills, but somehow he had missed the signs. He replayed the past in his mind, trying to find anything that would explain how he had failed to see the truth. Julia had always seemed devoted, calling him nightly during her work trips, acting like nothing had changed. But now with the photos in front of him, he saw the betrayal that had been lurking beneath the surface all along. He didn't hesitate. Without another thought, he arranged for a DNA test. The doubt in his mind had grown to an unbearable level, and he needed the truth, even if it shattered everything he had believed. He contacted a DNA testing service and picked up a kit that same day. It was clear now his marriage had been built on lies, and he needed to confront it head on. As he prepared to collect DNA samples from the kids, Tom felt a heavy weight on his shoulders. This wasn't just about the truth anymore. It was about protecting his family, and he knew the next steps would be painful. But he also knew that if Julia had been deceitful, he couldn't continue living a lie. It would be a long, messy road ahead, one that might involve a divorce, custody battles, and perhaps even the possibility of fraud charges if Julia had knowingly named him as the father while Alf was the biological parent. As Tom went through the motions of collecting the DNA samples, he felt the full weight of the decision ahead of him. The truth was no longer something he could ignore. It was time to take action. The days that followed were filled with a constant whirlwind of emotions for Tom. The truth was undeniable, and the DNA test results would soon be in his hands. But what was even more excruciating than the betrayal itself was the mental preparation for what came next. Tom had to decide how he would confront Julia, and, more importantly, how he would protect his children from the inevitable fallout. One evening, as he sat quietly at his desk, preparing for what would come, Julia called him from the East Coast. Her voice was light and cheery, but Tom could barely muster the energy to respond in kind. He kept the conversation short, playing it cool, all while knowing the truth was already out there, waiting to be confronted. Later that evening, he took the crucial step. He contacted Roger Dunleavy, a former detective turned private investigator. Roger had been a close ally during Tom's earlier days in law enforcement, and Tom trusted him completely. He needed someone to help him navigate this mess, especially if it would lead to a divorce and potential legal action. Roger assured Tom that he would handle everything discreetly, setting up surveillance on Julia's upcoming business trip. Tom's next call was to his lawyer, Lucy Hawkins, a no-nonsense divorce attorney, known for her aggressive tactics. Lucy had been Tom's confidant throughout this ordeal, and now she would help him take the next steps. They discussed the legal implications of paternity fraud, and Lucy confirmed that the situation was even worse than Tom had feared. If Julia had knowingly listed him as the father of children that weren't his, this would be classified as a criminal act. They began preparing for what would be a messy, painful process. As Julia's return date neared, Tom's anxiety intensified. He knew the time had come to confront her. But how would she react? Would she deny everything? Would she try to spin the truth to save herself? Regardless of her response, Tom had already made his decision. The marriage was over, and the truth needed to come out. The day Julia returned home, Tom was ready. His emotions were mixed: anger, sadness, but also a sense of cold determination. This was the moment he had been dreading, but also the moment he knew he had to face. He had prepared for this, both mentally and legally, and now it was time to finally confront the woman who had deceived him for years. Julia walked in, casually mentioning dinner plans, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. Tom didn't waste any time. He led her to the living room where Deputy Sarah Miles was waiting. The moment Julia saw Sarah, her confusion was palpable. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice filled with suspicion. "Who is this? Where are the kids?" "The kids are with your mother," Tom said firmly, his voice steady but cold. "We need to talk." Julia, still unaware of the gravity of the situation, tried to dismiss him. "I need a shower first," she said, brushing past him. But Tom was having none of it. He stopped her firmly. "Not this time, Julia. Sit down. We're doing this now." Julia hesitated, her eyes darting nervously between Tom and Sarah, but she eventually sat down. Tom reached into his pocket and pulled out a digital recorder, placing it on the table. "I hope you don't mind if we record this conversation," he said, his tone unwavering. "Given the circumstances, I think it's appropriate to advise you of your rights." Julia's eyes widened in panic. She stammered, trying to make sense of the situation, but Tom's voice was firm. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." The shock on Julia's face was evident as she processed his words. "What are you talking about?" she asked, voice trembling. Tom leaned forward, showing her the first document, the birth certificates of Andrew and Marie. "Do you recognize these?" he asked coldly. "What's this about?" she muttered, glancing at the papers, confused. Tom didn't give her a chance to explain. "Read the statement under your signature," he demanded. Julia's hands shook as she read the words aloud. "Under penalty of perjury, I certify that the above is true and factual, and that Thomas Jefferson Williams is the father of these children." Tom's gaze hardened. "So, tell me, Julia, who is the father of these children?" For a moment, Julia sat frozen, the color draining from her face. "You are," she stammered, but Tom was already pulling out the DNA test results from Acme Labs. "This says otherwise," he said, placing the documents in front of her. The results showed that Andrew and Marie were not biologically his children. The silence in the room was deafening. Julia's face contorted in anger as she finally snapped. "Fine!" she spat. "I wanted Alf's children, not yours. Yes, I signed the certificates. It was my decision. Tom's voice dropped to a dangerous calm. It's not your right to commit fraud, he replied. He then reached for his laptop and played the video footage. Footage of Julia and Alf in a hotel room, their connection undeniable. As the video played, Julia's face turned pale, and her deflection became less convincing. How did you get this? She asked weakly. Tom's gaze never left her. That's not the question. The real question is why you and Alf conspired to defraud me, he said, his voice icy. You both admitted that Alf is the biological father of Andrew and Marie, and you knowingly listed me as their father. That's fraud. Julia's defenses crumbled as the full weight of her actions sank in. She muttered, I lied to justify my affair, and I told others you were injured so no one would suspect. Tom leaned back, his expression hardening. So you lied to everyone, including your friends and coworkers. You didn't stop there. You even manipulated the truth about your marriage to cover up your affair. It's over, Julia. You can't lie your way out of this. With the truth finally out in the open, the atmosphere in the room became tense and suffocating. Julia's arrogance faded, replaced by a desperate, panicked realization of what she had done. She had betrayed Tom in the worst way possible. Not just by cheating, but by deceiving him into believing he was the father of children who were not his. The final blow came when Tom handed her the divorce papers, served with the help of Deputy Sarah Miles. Julia Williams, Sarah said, her voice firm and official, you've been served. The words were final, and the shock on Julia's face said it all. She blinked in confusion as she grasped the weight of the moment. What is this? She asked weakly, her voice cracking. Divorce papers, Tom replied coldly, on the grounds of infidelity and fraud. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Tom could hardly look at Julia anymore. The woman he had loved for so long, the mother of his children, had destroyed everything with her lies, but the worst was yet to come. As Julia struggled to comprehend what was happening, Sarah's tone turned sharper. You are under arrest for paternity fraud and conspiracy to commit fraud. She stepped forward, producing a pair of handcuffs, and the reality of the situation set in. Julia's face contorted with panic and disbelief. This can't be happening, she cried, her voice breaking. Oh, it's happening, Tom said coldly. Fraud is a felony in this state. I suggest you get a lawyer. As Sarah led Julia away in handcuffs, Tom stood there, feeling a strange mix of relief and deep sorrow. For over 20 years, he had loved Julia. He had trusted her with everything, and now he had to watch her face the consequences of her actions. The next few days were filled with difficult decisions and painful realizations. Tom had to explain everything to his children, Andrew and Marie. It was the hardest conversation of his life, and the pain in their eyes was almost more than he could bear. But he knew they deserved the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Your mother lied to me. She lied to all of us, Tom said softly. I'm not your biological father. I raised you, loved you, and nothing changes that. You're still my kids. Andrew, ever the stoic one, stood frozen for a moment before walking over to Tom. Am I still your son? He asked quietly. Tom pulled him into an embrace, his voice thick with emotion. Of course you are. You'll always be my son. Marie, overwhelmed by the truth, broke down into tears. I love you, Daddy, she sobbed, and Tom held her tightly, his own tears mixing with hers. He knew their family had been torn apart, but the bond they shared was still unbreakable. The legal process that followed was grueling. Julia was arrested and charged with paternity fraud and conspiracy. Alf, the man behind the betrayal, was also arrested, and both were convicted of their crimes. Julia received a sentence of 10 years in prison, while Alf got 5 years. Tom, however, found a glimmer of hope in the midst of the darkness. His civil suit against Alf resulted in a significant financial settlement, which he placed in college funds for Andrew and Marie. He ensured that his children's future would be secure, no matter what happened. As life began to slowly return to normal, Tom focused on his career. He was promoted to captain, a role he had worked for his entire life. But despite his professional success, he had little interest in dating again. He was content with his children and their future, and the emotional scars from his marriage to Julia were still too fresh. One day, however, Marie handed him a note. "Miss Harris, my English teacher, wants to meet you," she said with a grin. Tom raised an eyebrow, teasing, "This isn't one of your matchmaking schemes, is it?" But despite his initial reluctance, Tom agreed to meet Miss Harris. And when they did, something sparked between them. They shared a light moment. And for the first time in years, Tom felt a glimmer of hope for a new beginning.